The House of Noth is a 2021 novel, I think, by Philip Wortmann, and it is a standalone fantasy novel that is, well, maybe a little different than your standard epic fantasy novel from these, well, recent years, but I do think epic fantasy is still a label that would fit it for anyone looking for indie books of this variety, or, well, I guess any fantasy book, since I don't really distinguish between independent or whatnot. So this starts with from the south traveling Gaba, who stops at the hillock home of Master and Lady Watcher. They talk to the king in Imnir and the shadows growing. Immediately, I think there is the evidence of a nice use of a language. It is rather simple at times. It's not overly archaic or overly prosodic like it is in, say, William Morris's early stuff. And it is not hard to understand, is essentially what I'm saying. But for example, we have the word remembrance used seemingly in the same way as the word souvenir, which is exactly what that means anyhow, and is completely understandable. But the Watcher, a couple here, are harassed by a shadow described as a bandit, and twice the height of a man and with two horns like a ram. This is the ibex. So already you also get some interesting characteristics of monstrous characteristics, obviously, but also seemingly just like human characteristics. Again, it kind of reminds me of how figures are described in, say, like Beowulf, or in some other northern literature from the early medieval, high medieval period, I guess, in some cases. So on the steppes, though, and this is where the main focus of the book comes in, we meet the river people, a clan of nomads deemed cursed by their ancestors' deeds and their very nature, being children of moonlight and dust and gray-skinned. They also have golden eyes of a lion. Our focus here, at first at least, is Huthram, captain of the scouts, and Wingelin, daughter of the chieftain, though that is like a very brief focus in a sense. Some obvious inspiration from Tolkien, I would say, is evident, who admittedly is a good source to pull from. But the Sword of Shannara and Eye of the World are obviously inspired by Tolkien as well, and this is better than those. It also doesn't really read anything like them. So Wortmann has some similar inspirations, I would say, that Tolkien did, set in a period that feels like some legendary days of yore. And in this place, I'd say it feels more Morris medieval-esque than Tolkien really at all. If you've read The House of the Wolfings, it kind of feels like that. So it also seems more anthropological, as the nomad group are in a semi-permanent settlement that seems well on its way to becoming permanent. So there's a change in society that I think at least feels like it was approached in an anthropological sense. Not like annoyingly scientific, but, just purposeful. And I think the idea of getting out what will these roots mean for these people and these characters, besides pastoral being replaced with agrarian production, well, is due to the people's connection to the land. And what does a connection to the land even mean? Especially when you go from nomadic to, sedentary. Beyond a sense of heroic past or of an origin for peoples, a story or myth of the past, there's a stronger sense of local lore for the folk as well. Tales that are a bit more fairy tale-esque or happenings of the spiritual or supernatural are present. I would say the story itself focuses mostly on Althane, son of a carpenter, and a henchman, a type of mystic. He's really the main character in a sense, but he's definitely a key character. His journey is adventurous and fantastic at times, but very tied in to, again, a sense of self, his spirit, and the myth of the past. And then I would say, in particular, where the House of Noth itself comes up a little bit more than a third of the way through, is also tied to his story. It's shortly after this, though, that the story becomes much more adventurous. That after the call in the first section, which actually has like a resolution, but that first chunk of the book, maybe a third of it or so, feels very different than the later half of the book. I don't say very different, not like it's two different works. Definitely seems like it's kind of done in episodes, in a sense. And while I think that you could definitely critique it for plot structure, I'm just kind of fine with how Wortmann just does his thing. I think maybe it's a little clunky at times, and I think there are a lot of scenes that seem like they're just dressing, and maybe the plot doesn't move along like you would expect it to. But at the same time, like, I just let an artist do their art, and in some ways, again, it reminds me, particularly like lacking the instruction from the poetics of, say, some ancient classical author, capital C. It is, more along the lines of say, like Beowulf, which often gets literary critiques in it because of its lack of plot, if you will. So I don't really have a problem with that. But we do, again, get more characters from the side of a bigger society. We get, they're largely from Ymnir, the main one being Istrith, I would say, and she's a very interesting character that I really enjoyed, actually. And I think one thing, though, that the book really gets into, besides, some obvious inspiration from, say, like Saga of the Volsunds or whatever, right, is that the book feels very mythical and gets into, theologically inspired stuff. I think you could argue, again, that it's, in some sense, inspired by the myth of theology, even in particular, and I don't mean myth as in the sense of false, just a story of theology, particularly probably a Christian one, but take that as you will. It is also infused with things like the readers of Beowulf, or again, or Saga of the Volsunds, or early Germanic stories will recognize some inspiration from those, since not written in poetry, reads a good amount like a saga, but, it is a modern novel, of course. This is a tough work, though, in a sense, to read. I think many of the, again, criticisms given in the review from the Corn Crake are valid. There is a lot going on. It portrays a certain attitude of societal roles and human nature in a pre-industrial sense, which is fine. I mean, I think even the romantics who are responding to industrialization do particular things that, in some sense, have really colored our current criticisms that aren't necessarily useful when you're looking at a work that is more medieval, for example, like originality, right? That is something that doesn't really work very well when you're critiquing medieval works, for example, and I think Wortmann is kind of in that vein anyways. So the story itself is very conservative in some senses. It doesn't fall into any sort of racial supremacy. I wouldn't worry about that at all. It's also very lovely. And again, I wouldn't compare it over much to Tolkien. If I would compare it to anyone, which I think comparison can definitely be more of a hindrance sometimes, but I'd much more compare it to Morris if you read any of Morris's prose romances. But even then, it has a lot of stuff within that is not like that at all. It's definitely Wortmann's own style. The narrative is often a bit much, I think, considering what is being fit into a relatively short book, and I will say it's not really as messy as, say, something like Ed Greenwood's Fashion, which can get really messy and confusing and convoluted and just not work very well. This is an epic, kind of coming hard and fast in a sense because of just how short it is and how much it's trying to do. Which, thinking about that, is better than, I would say, dragging this out ridiculously like many epic fantasies do today, which I really don't like at all. But this is one thing that I can imagine rereading, actually, and I think there is much literary value here, linguistic value, and I think the art itself is good practice. I think, at least, I imagine the author will become better at expressing such a beauty and wisdom, given more time. Also, we'll mention, as speaking of art, that the map at the beginning, which I think is really lovely looking, and the pictures at the start of each chapter, like in old school Dragonlance, for example, are rather simple in style, but nice touches from the author as illustrator. Anyways, leave from Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.